Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I caught a strange signal on my ham radio. Now the government is watching me. Alright, let me just start off by saying, I'm not some conspiracy nut. I'm not out here with a tinfoil hat waiting for aliens to abduct me, or worried the government is tracking my every move. At least, I wasn't. Until about 3 weeks ago. Now, I'm not so sure. It all started on a regular Friday night. I've been a ham radio hobbyist for a while now. Picked it up a few years ago when I moved to a quieter rural town. There's something calming about sitting in my small, cluttered garage late at night, spinning dials, catching signals from people halfway around the world. Some folks like video games or binging Netflix. I like hearing the crackle of voices from places I'll never go. Anyway, I was doing just that, minding my own business, fiddling with frequencies, when I stumbled across something weird. Now normally, you catch bits and pieces of conversations, truckers on long hauls, random chatter from local radio enthusiasts, the occasional international signal if the weather's just right. But this was different. The static was harsh, broken by these rhythmic beeps. At first, I thought it was just Morse code or something, but it didn't follow any patterns I recognized. I've heard enough Morse code to know this wasn't it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I kept listening, tweaking the frequency to clear it up. The beeps grew louder, more distinct, almost like a countdown. But before I could fully process that, a voice cut through the static, so clear it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't your typical broadcast voice. No friendly chatter, no identifiable accent. It was flat, emotionless, like someone reading from a script. And they said one word: verify. I froze. Imagine being in a dark room, listening to static, and out of nowhere, someone's cold, robotic voice just says that. Verify. What the hell was I supposed to verify? I sat there for a few seconds, staring at my radio, half expecting it to say something else, but nothing. Just more beeps. Then, a few seconds later, the voice repeated, this time more forceful, like it knew I was still listening. Verify. At this point, I'm fully creeped out, but I'm also stupidly curious, so I grabbed my notepad and scribbled down the frequency. It wasn't one I recognized, and I couldn't find any record of it online. I spent the next hour scanning forums, trying to figure out what the hell I had just stumbled onto, but no one had a clue. After a while, I shrugged it off as some weird prank or glitch. Maybe it was a test signal for some kind of obscure military thing. Who knows what the government does on these frequencies, right? But then things got weirder. The next night, I tuned into the same frequency. Why? Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it was nothing, or maybe I was just bored. But the second I dialed in, the beeps started up again, right on cue. Then the voice returned. You are being monitored. Verify. I yanked the dial, cutting the signal off instantly. My heart was pounding in my chest. I'm not an anxious person, but something about that voice felt wrong. I stared at my radio for a good 5 minutes, debating whether or not to turn it back on. It was probably just some joke, right? But what if it wasn't? I decided to call it a night. I turned off the radio, locked up the garage, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that voice, that cold, empty demand. Verify. The next morning, I woke up to something that made my blood run cold. A black sedan was parked across the street from my house. Now, I live on a quiet road. It's not the kind of place where random cars just show up and sit around. The nearest neighbor is a mile away, and we don't exactly get a lot of traffic. But there it was, sleek, unmarked, and definitely out of place. I figured it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had car trouble, but when I looked out the window a few hours later, it was still there. No one got in or out. No one came by to check on it. Just sitting there, watching. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside, trying to act casual. As I approached the car, I could see there were 2 people inside, both wearing sunglasses, both staring straight ahead like I didn't even exist. I got close enough to knock on the window, but before I could raise my hand, the engine roared to life, and they sped off, without so much as a glance in my direction. Weird, right? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the uneasy feeling that was growing in the pit of my stomach. Maybe I'd made a mistake by tuning into that signal. Maybe this wasn't just a random broadcast. Maybe I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to hear. And if that was the case, who was watching me now? The car sped off, and I stood there in my driveway, watching as the dust settled. For a minute, I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just stared down the road, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. 2 guys in an unmarked car, parked across the street from my house, then taking off the second I got close. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know that's not normal. But I didn't have time to process it. I had a day to get through, and the last thing I needed was to spiral into paranoia. I went back inside, poured myself some coffee, and tried to act like everything was fine. You know, like you do when you want to pretend the universe isn't messing with you. But man, the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my radio across the room. It was turned off, just sitting there, innocent enough. But all I could think about was that voice, cold and commanding. You are being monitored. By mid-afternoon, I was convinced I'd overreacted. Maybe the car thing was a coincidence. People park in random spots sometimes, right? And the radio, well, that could have been anything. Military tests, an encrypted message. Hell, maybe even some ham radio nerd playing a prank. That's when I noticed something off. I keep my ham radio gear on a shelf next to the door that leads to the garage. Everything's neatly organized because I'm kind of a stickler about my setup. But as I glanced over at it, I realized the dials were off. I hadn't touched it since last night, but the frequency knob was turned. Not by much, just a tiny shift. Barely noticeable, but enough for me to tell something was different. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe you bumped it. Maybe it was nothing. But no, I'm careful about my gear, and that dial was in the exact position I left it in when I turned the radio off last night. So, who moved it? I walked over carefully, like the thing might bite me, and adjusted the dial back. The second I did, the radio crackled to life. I hadn't even switched it on. That cold, robotic voice came through again, this time even clearer than before. You have been warned. Do not attempt to locate us. Chills shot down my spine. I yanked the power cord out of the wall, almost knocking the whole rig over in my panic. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the dead radio, like it might spring back to life without power. What the hell was going on? It didn't make any sense. I was just a guy with a ham radio. I wasn't trying to locate anyone. I didn't even want to. I wanted nothing to do with whatever creepy signal I'd found, but it didn't matter what I wanted. That night, after hours of pacing around the house and constantly peeking through the curtains, I decided I needed to get out, clear my head. I grabbed my keys and headed to the one bar in town that stayed open late. It's the kind of dive where you can sit at the counter, drink a beer, and not have to make small talk with anyone. Perfect for a guy who felt like his life was turning into an episode of The Twilight Zone. I parked out front and walked in, nodding to the bartender. It was a quiet night, just a few regulars nursing their drinks. I found a seat near the back and ordered a beer. For a while, I just sat there, trying to drown out the paranoia with alcohol. But then, about an hour in, I noticed something. A man had come in and sat down a few stools away from me. Now, that wouldn't be weird on its own. People come and go in bars all the time. But this guy, he was watching me. Every time I glanced his way, his eyes were on me, unblinking, like he wasn't even trying to hide it. He was wearing a gray suit, the kind that looked just a little too clean for a place like this. And he had this, I don't know, official look about him, like he didn't belong here, like he wasn't here to drink. My heart started racing. Was he one of the guys from the car? No, I couldn't tell. His face was too plain, too forgettable, the kind of face that you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But it was his eyes. They weren't just looking at me, they were looking through me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just on edge. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, as I reached for my beer, he stood up. He didn't approach me, didn't say a word, but he placed something on the stool where he'd been sitting and walked out. I sat there, staring at the object for what felt like an eternity. It was a small, black envelope. Against every instinct telling me to leave it alone, I reached over and grabbed it. My hands were shaking as I slid it into my jacket pocket, and suddenly, I felt like every set of eyes in the bar was on me. I finished my drink, left cash on the counter, and bolted out of there. I didn't open the envelope until I was home, safely locked inside. When I finally tore it open, I found a single sheet of paper inside. No writing, no logo, just a grainy black and white photo, a photo of me, sitting at my ham radio. I could feel the walls closing in around me. There was no mistaking it. This was taken from inside my house. Someone had been watching me, in my own home. I dropped the photo like it was burning my fingers. My mind raced. Who had taken it? How had they gotten inside? And what the hell did they want with me? The last question haunted me as I paced the length of my living room, trying to figure out what my next move should be. But then my phone rang. The number was blocked. I hesitated, staring at the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. But some sick part of me needed to know. So, I answered. A familiar voice came through the speaker, cold and devoid of emotion. Do not interfere. The line went dead. That phone call, it shook me. Not in the way where you get startled and then shrug it off. No, this was the kind of fear that seeps into your bones and settles in, like it's claiming a permanent spot in your brain. The voice, the same damn voice from the radio, knew. It knew where I was. It knew what I'd done. And now it knew I was scared. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I ended up sitting on my couch, staring at the door with every light in the house on, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No strange knocks, no black cars, no more phone calls. Just silence. Dead. Empty silence. Morning rolled around and I made myself a decision. I was done. Whatever I had stumbled into, it wasn't worth it. I'd pack up my radio, stash it away in the garage, and pretend none of this ever happened. It's funny how we convince ourselves that we can just walk away from stuff, like turning off a switch in our heads. I guess I thought if I stopped listening, stopped looking, they'd stop watching, but it wasn't that simple. I dragged the radio out to the garage, careful not to touch the dials again, and stuffed it in a cardboard box. I figured I'd drop it at a pawn shop later, or hell, maybe even smash it to pieces just to be sure. Either way, I wasn't keeping it in the house. With that done, I went back inside, hoping I could finally shake the feeling that I was being watched. But as soon as I stepped through the door, my phone rang. Again. Blocked number. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My stomach twisted. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the screen, wondering if I should answer. What could they possibly want now? I hadn't even touched the radio. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I didn't answer this time. I let it ring, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The call just went on and on, like it wasn't going to stop until I acknowledged it. When it finally went to voicemail, I almost sighed in relief. But that didn't last long. A minute later, the voicemail icon popped up. My heart sank. My phone wasn't the type to transcribe messages, but even seeing that little notification made my skin crawl. I clicked on the voicemail, and there it was, just a few seconds long, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The same robotic voice from before. This is your final warning. Do not engage further. The message ended, but the impact stayed with me. I knew one thing for sure. I was in over my head, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I couldn't stop thinking about it. No matter how much I wanted to forget the radio, to move on, to pretend like none of this had happened, my brain wouldn't let me. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of puzzle that I hadn't asked to solve. But now I was too deep in to walk away, and I wasn't sure they were going to let me walk away anyway. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and restless nights. I started noticing little things. Cars I didn't recognize parked a little too close to my house. Strangers on the street glancing in my direction for a second too long. The feeling that I was never really alone, that no matter where I went, someone was watching. One evening, I came home from running errands, and as soon as I walked through the door, I froze. My living room window was open. Now, that might not sound weird on its own. Maybe I'd left it open by mistake, right? But I never opened that window. Ever. It sticks, and it's a pain to shut, so I usually leave it alone. But now it was wide open, the curtains fluttering. In the evening breeze, I checked every room, every corner of the house, convinced I'd find someone hiding inside. But there was nothing. No signs of a break-in, no missing items, just an open window. And yet, something felt off. I was about to close the window when I noticed something on the floor, just beneath the sill. It was a small black device. At first, I thought it was a thumb drive, but when I picked it up, I realized it was something else entirely, something I didn't recognize. It had a tiny antenna sticking out of the side and a single red LED light that blinked intermittently. Someone had been here. Someone had planted this thing in my house, and I had no idea what it was. My first instinct was to destroy it, to smash it against the wall and be done with it. But I stopped myself. If they wanted me to find it, maybe they were watching for my reaction. Maybe that was part of their game, so instead, I did the opposite. I put the device back where I found it, left the window open, and pretended like I hadn't seen it. Maybe if I acted like nothing was wrong, they'd think I wasn't a threat. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would they plant a device where I'd be sure to find it? Unless they wanted me to know they were watching. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with all the possibilities. Who were these people? What did they want? And more importantly, what the hell had I done to attract their attention? I kept telling myself that I was just a guy who had picked up a weird signal on his radio. But deep down, I knew there had to be more to it. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off to sleep, but I wasn't out for long. I woke up to a sound, faint but unmistakable, a low, constant hum, almost like static. It took me a second to realize where it was coming from. The garage. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding in my chest. The radio. It was still in the box, still packed away. There was no way it should be on. But when I opened the door to the garage, there it was, alive again, crackling with that familiar static. But that wasn't the worst part. The dials had been turned, again, this time to a different frequency. And through the static, I could hear something faint, barely audible. A voice, but not like before. This one wasn't robotic. It was soft, distant, like someone calling out from far away. I leaned in, straining to hear the words. You shouldn't have listened. The voice faded into static again, leaving me in the dark, cold garage, my heart racing and my mind spinning. Who was this? And what did they mean? And then, the static cut off, replaced by one final message, clear as day, echoing through the small space. You've been compromised. After that last message, you've been compromised. I stood in the garage for what felt like hours, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What did they mean? Compromised by who? What had I done? The cold, mechanical voice echoed in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was in a game I didn't understand, like I was a pawn, and someone was moving pieces behind the scenes. I turned the radio off, for real this time, yanking the cord out of the wall. I wanted nothing to do with it. The thing felt cursed, like it had opened a door to something I was never supposed to see. The house was too quiet though. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Sleep wasn't happening that night, so I did what anyone would do when they're freaking out. I went online, hoping to find something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. I ended up deep diving into forums, conspiracy threads, and dark corners of the internet that I probably had no business being in. The more I searched, the less I found. No one had ever reported anything exactly like what I was experiencing. Sure, there were stories about weird ham radio signals, mysterious broadcasts, even tales of military cover-ups, but nothing fit this exactly. It felt like I was chasing shadows. Then right when I was about to give up, I stumbled on something. A single post buried deep in an old conspiracy forum from years ago. The title was simple. They don't want you to hear it. I clicked it, expecting some half-baked theory about government spies or aliens. But the post was short, just a few sentences long. It talked about a signal, a frequency that no one was supposed to find. It mentioned people disappearing after hearing it. And then, at the bottom, there was a frequency number, the same one I had stumbled onto. I stared at the screen, feeling the air leave my lungs. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone else had found it. Someone else had been listening. But the post was years old, and there were no replies, no follow-ups, nothing. I clicked on the user's profile. It was gone, deleted, like they'd vanished without a trace. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to type. Who was this person? What happened to them? And then, as I sat there in the dark, my computer screen flickered. I thought it was a glitch at first, maybe my Wi-Fi acting up, but the flickering got worse. The lights in the house started to dim, and suddenly, the entire room went black. Total darkness. My computer screen shut off. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen went silent. Everything just stopped. A blackout. I sat there frozen in my chair. The house was pitch black. The only sound, my own shallow breathing. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. No signal, no power, nothing. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was rain. Just the wind blowing something against the side of the house. But the pattern was too deliberate, too precise. I stood up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest, and moved toward the window. I couldn't see anything, but the tapping was louder now, coming from the back of the house, near the garage. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a crowbar I kept in the hall closet, and edged my way toward the garage door. Every instinct was screaming at me, not to open it, but I had to know. I had to see what was making that noise. I swung the door open and stepped into the garage. There was nothing there, just the dead radio, sitting in the box where I'd left it. The window was shut, the air still, no sign of anything out of place. But the tapping, it hadn't stopped. It was coming from outside the garage now, just beyond the window. I stepped toward it, crowbar in hand, and peeked through the blinds. That's when I saw him. A man, standing in the middle of my backyard, motionless, staring straight at the house. He was too far away from me to make out his face, but there was something wrong about the way he stood. Too still, too rigid, like he wasn't even breathing. He was wearing a dark coat, his arms at his sides, and I swear, even though I couldn't see his eyes clearly, I could feel him looking at me. The tapping stopped. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But where? The power was out, my phone was dead, and there was no way I was going outside with that guy just standing there. For a long time, I just stood in the garage, waiting, listening, but there was only silence. No more tapping, no more strange noises, just that same awful stillness. I peeked through the blinds again, and this time, the man was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. It was like he'd never been there at all. But I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't imagining this. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to go back inside. I locked every door, closed every window, and sat in the middle of my living room with the crowbar clutched in my hands like a lifeline. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power came back. The lights flickered on, my computer whirred to life, and the hum of the refrigerator returned. Everything was back to normal, like the blackout had never happened, but nothing felt normal. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I sat there, staring at my computer screen, and then something caught my eye. A new email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a random string of letters and numbers. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse, but I clicked on it anyway. The email had no subject, just a single sentence. "You were warned." Attached was a video file. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed not to. but some sick part of my brain had to know. I clicked on the file. The video was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. It was footage of me, sitting at my desk, right now, in real time. And in the corner of the video, barely visible in the darkness of the window behind me, was the reflection of a man standing just outside my house, watching me. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just seen. That video, the man outside. How long had he been there? How long had they been watching me? I jumped out of my chair, every instinct telling me to get out. I couldn't stay in the house, not with someone lurking just outside. My skin prickled, and I could almost feel eyes on me, like I was being watched from every corner of the room. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and bolted out the front door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. The street outside was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No cars, no neighbors, just that thick, oppressive silence that felt like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I glanced around, half expecting to see the man in the dark coat watching from the shadows, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath and made my way to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Where could I even go? It wasn't like I could call the police and tell them someone was watching me. Through my ham radio, they'd think I was crazy. I started the engine, the familiar rumble calming me for just a second, and pulled out of the driveway. My plan was simple. Drive. Just keep moving until I felt safe, until I could think clearly. But the second I turned onto the road, I saw it. Another black car. It was parked a few houses down, just sitting there, engine running. And inside, two figures, both wearing dark coats and sunglasses, staring straight ahead, like they were waiting for me. My stomach dropped. There was no doubt in my mind. They were the same people who'd been parked outside my house before. I floored it. My tires screeched as I tore down the street, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. In my rearview mirror, I saw the black car pull out behind me, following at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, just close enough to let me know they weren't losing me. Panic set in. I swerved through side streets, taking random turns, trying to shake them, but no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me, like they knew where I was going before I did. It didn't matter how fast I drove, they were always there, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I don't know how long I drove for. Hours, maybe. The city lights blurred together as I sped through the empty streets, and all I could think about was how to lose them. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. Whoever these people were, whatever this thing was I'd stumbled onto, it was too big, too powerful. There was no escaping it. Eventually I found myself on the outskirts of town, the roads quieter, fewer streetlights. The black car was still behind me, keeping its distance, but never letting me out of sight. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the wheel steady. I had no plan, no idea what to do next. I just wanted it to stop. All of it. That's when I saw it. A motel. One of those run-down places on the side of the highway where no one asks questions. The neon sign flickered weakly in the night, and something about it felt safe, or at least safer than the open road. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires crunching on the gravel, and parked as close to the entrance as I could. The black car didn't follow me in. Instead, it slowed to a crawl on the road, like they were watching me make my move. But they didn't pull in. They just kept driving, disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled out of the car and rushed inside the motel. The guy at the front desk barely looked up as I slapped some cash down and asked for a room. I didn't care what it cost. I just needed to hide, to get off the street and away from the eyes I could feel on me. The room was as grimy as I expected, but I didn't care. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. My mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. Why me? Why had this all started? What was it about that signal that had drawn them to me? I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I pulled it out, the screen was shattered, cracked down the middle, like it had been smashed while I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard it again, that low, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I froze. The room was pitch dark, the only light coming from the neon sign outside, casting an eerie glow through the dirty curtains. I stood up slowly, my heart racing in my chest, and moved toward the window. The tapping was faint, but deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I pulled the curtain back, just an inch, enough to peek outside. And there he was, the man in the dark coat, standing just outside the window, staring straight at me. His face was pale, almost featureless in the dim light, but his eyes, those eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, cold, like he'd been waiting for me to look. Tap, tap, tap. He raised his hand and tapped on the glass again, so softly it was almost polite. But there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't even breathing. He just stood there, tapping. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was still, too still. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced down at it, the cracked screen flickering to life for just a second, long enough for me to see the message. You should have listened. I looked back at the window. The man was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. The motel room was silent, the air thick with the kind of dread that makes you feel like you're drowning. My hand shook as I set the phone down on the bed and slumped into the chair by the door. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. And as the hours dragged on, I realized something. I was never going to get answers. I was never going to understand what had happened, why they had come for me, or what they wanted. Because that's the thing. They didn't need me to understand. They just needed me to stop. And I had. I stopped searching. I stopped listening. But it didn't matter, because they'd been watching all along. I found a government drone in my backyard. It's monitoring something that isn't human. It all started about 2 weeks ago, but I guess it really kicked off last Tuesday. You know those random moments when you're just outside, minding your own business, and something weird happens? Well, this was definitely one of those moments. I live in a pretty quiet suburb, nothing special. Houses lined up, same old sidewalks, the occasional neighbor peeking over the fence to say hello. You know the drill. It's the kind of place where nothing ever happens, or at least, I thought that was the case. So last Tuesday, I was out in the backyard, messing around with some lawn chairs I'd been meaning to clean off for months. I had a podcast playing through my phone's speaker, some true crime thing. Anyway, while I'm doing this, I hear this faint buzzing sound, like a mosquito, but louder. I look around, thinking it's just an old neighbor's lawnmower, or maybe a drone some kid's flying around the neighborhood. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I catch something hovering. There, right above my shed, was a small drone. Nothing fancy. Looked like one of those cheap ones you can buy off Amazon for $100. But something about this one was off. It wasn't moving around or darting back and forth like drones usually do. It was just hovering there, super still, like it was watching. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighborhood kids lost control of it. I mean, that happens, right? But after standing there staring at it for a good minute, it didn't move. Not an inch. I couldn't shake this feeling that it wasn't a toy drone. It was too precise. I waved my arms at it, tried to shoo it away, but nothing. The thing just stayed there, perfectly still, almost like it didn't care that I noticed it. The weirdest part? It had no brand markings, no obvious camera, no flashing lights, nothing. Eventually, I figured whoever was controlling it would come get it. I mean, someone's got to notice their drone is just hovering in some random guy's backyard, right? But after a while, the thing just quietly drifted off. No quick movements or sudden turns, just a slow glide into the trees behind my house, like it was casually leaving. That night, I didn't think much more of it. I figured it was a one-time thing. But the next morning, I woke up and saw it again. Same drone, same position, hovering over my shed like it hadn't moved at all. Now, here's where things get creepy. This time, I tried something different. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera, and zoomed in on it. But no matter how close I zoomed, it just looked blurry, like my phone couldn't focus on it properly. I'm not saying it was invisible or anything. My phone definitely saw something. But no matter how hard I tried to get a clear shot, it was like the drone didn't want to be captured. After a couple of minutes of failed attempts, the drone slowly drifted off again, disappearing into the trees just like before. Now, I've seen some weird stuff on YouTube about government surveillance and all that conspiracy theory nonsense. But this was different. This felt deliberate, like something was being monitored, but not in the way you'd expect. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that drone. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone be watching my backyard? I'm not some big shot politician or criminal, just a guy with a dead-end job and a quiet life. But then something else occurred to me. I wasn't the only one living around here. Beyond the tree line in my backyard, there's this old patch of woods that no one really goes into. It's been there since before I moved in, and most of the neighbors kind of ignore it. Nothing weird about that, right? But there had been rumors, stories, mostly from kids, about strange things happening in those woods. I always wrote it off as urban legend stuff, but now I was starting to wonder. Maybe it wasn't me the drone was watching. Maybe it was watching the woods. That's when I made up my mind. The next time I saw that thing, I was going to follow it. I needed to know where it was going, and more importantly, what it was watching. Little did I know that this decision was the beginning of a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. I waited 3 days without seeing the drone, which was weird because it had shown up like clockwork before. I started to think maybe I scared it off, like whoever was behind it decided to pack up and move on. But that third day, just when I was starting to forget about the whole thing, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't hovering over my backyard. It was hovering at the edge of the woods, right where the tree line begins. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, like it was waiting. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just sick of feeling like I was being watched. But I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone in my pocket, and headed out the back door. The moment I stepped into my yard, the drone didn't react. It didn't move or speed away like I half expected it to. It just kept hovering, silently watching. When I reached the edge of the woods, the air felt different, cooler, almost like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. You know when you walk into a place and everything just feels wrong? Like you shouldn't be there? That's exactly how it felt. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know where the drone was going. The moment I stepped into the trees, the drone started moving, but not quickly. Just a slow, steady glide deeper into the woods. It was like it wanted me to follow. Now, here's the thing. I've never really gone into those woods before. Nobody has a reason to. The trees are thick, the ground is uneven, and there aren't any trails. But the drone seemed to know exactly where it was going, weaving between the trees like it had done this 100 times before. I followed it for what felt like hours, but when I checked my phone, only 20 minutes had passed. The further I went, the stranger things became. The buzzing sound from the drone seemed to fade, like it was being absorbed by the trees themselves. Everything got quieter. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just silence. That kind of eerie silence that makes you realize how loud the world usually is. As I kept following the drone, I started noticing these weird markings on the trees. They weren't normal carvings or anything a person could have done. They looked wrong. Almost like burn marks, but in strange twisting patterns that seemed to shift if you stared at them too long. My chest tightened as I realized these markings weren't random. They were leading somewhere. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe the outline of a large tree in the distance, but as I got closer, it became clear that it wasn't a tree at all. It was a structure. Hidden in the middle of these thick woods was this bunker, or at least it looked like a bunker. Concrete, overgrown with vines and moss, half buried in the ground like it had been forgotten. No windows, no doors that I could see, just this massive, weathered slab sticking out of the earth. The drone stopped just above the bunker, hovering like it had reached its destination. For the first time, I hesitated. Something about that place screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't, not yet. I circled the bunker, trying to find a way inside. There had to be something. And then I saw it. A small metal hatch, partially hidden under a layer of dirt and leaves. The kind of hatch you'd expect to see on an old fallout shelter or a military base. My heart was pounding now. I reached down, wiped the dirt away, and grabbed the handle. The metal was cold and heavy, like it hadn't been touched in years. But when I pulled, it opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the woods. Inside was a dark stairwell leading down. No lights, no sounds, just this yawning black hole descending into the ground. The drone hovered above me, almost like it was waiting for me to make the next move. At that point, every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to walk away, close the hatch, and pretend I'd never seen any of this. But then something caught my eye. At the base of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light, was something moving. I froze. It wasn't a person, or at least not exactly a person. The figure was hunched, its limbs too long, skin pale, and stretched tight across its body. It was twitching, its head jerking in quick, unnatural movements, like it was trying to sniff the air, but couldn't figure out how. I stood there, paralyzed, watching this thing at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't seem to notice me yet, but as I stood there, I realized something terrifying. This thing wasn't moving randomly. It was standing right below the drone, mirroring its movements like it was being controlled or guided by it. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the thing snapped its head up, its eyes, if you could call them that, locking onto me. And then, with this sudden, jerky movement, it started climbing the stairs. I didn't wait. I slammed the hatch shut, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it below, scratching, trying to get out. But I didn't stick around to find out if it could. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, tearing through the woods, branches scraping at my face and arms, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was back in my yard, the drone nowhere to be seen. That night, I sat on my couch, staring at the backyard through the window, half expecting the drone to return. It didn't, but I knew, deep down, that whatever was in those woods wasn't done with me. And that drone? It wasn't just monitoring. It was controlling something. Something that wasn't human. Something that had just seen me. I couldn't sleep. Not after that. And I knew I'd have to go back, because now, the drone wasn't the only thing watching me. The next few days were a blur. I didn't go back into the woods. Hell, I didn't even go outside. I kept thinking about that thing, the way it moved, the way it looked at me. But what scared me the most wasn't the creature itself. It was the drone, the way it hovered so calmly above that bunker, as if it was in control. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some wild animal hiding in the woods. It was being watched, or worse, directed. I tried to act normal, went to work, pretended like everything was fine, but every time I sat down, closed my eyes, or even took a breath, I could still feel the weight of that thing's eyes on me. I couldn't shake the sense that it hadn't forgotten about me, that it was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't until Saturday night that things really took a turn. It was around 11 p.m. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, but not really watching anything. You know that feeling when you're physically in one place, but mentally you're somewhere else. Yeah, I was there. My phone was on the table in front of me, notifications buzzing every now and then, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I just felt off, like something was about to happen, and then it did. A soft knock at the front door. At first, I didn't even register it. My brain was so fried that I just assumed it was one of those random noises houses make at night. But then it came again, this time louder. Knock, knock. I froze. It was late, and no one ever knocks on my door at that time of night. My heart rate picked up, and I strained my ears, trying to listen for any other sounds. Nothing, just the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator. But whoever, or whatever, was knocking wasn't going away. Knock, knock, knock. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something about the rhythm of the knocking was off, too slow, too deliberate, like it was waiting for me to come to the door. Against every instinct, I got up and walked to the front hallway, careful to stay quiet. I didn't turn on the light, just peeked through the peephole, hoping to see some late-night delivery guy or a neighbor who'd gotten locked out. But when I looked, there was no one there. The porch was empty, The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the yard, but I couldn't see anyone standing at the door. I stepped back, trying to shake the creeping feeling crawling up my spine. Maybe it was some prank. A couple of teenagers messing around, trying to scare people late at night. But that didn't sit right with me. The knock hadn't felt like a prank. It felt calculated. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye through the front window. Movement. Just at the edge of my yard, near the tree line, where the woods began, I saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, half hidden behind a tree, but I knew what it was. That same pale, hunched thing I'd seen in the bunker. Only this time, it wasn't twitching or jerking around. It was standing still, watching my house, watching me. For a long, terrifying moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. It didn't move, and I didn't dare breathe. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it could hear me. The thing was tall, way taller than I remembered. Its limbs hung low and loose, almost too long for its body, and its head was tilted at this weird, unnatural angle, like it was trying to figure out what I was. But the worst part? It wasn't alone. Behind it, deeper in the trees, I saw more movement, more shapes, dozens of them. All of them standing just out of reach of the light, waiting in the shadows, their twisted forms barely visible. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at those things. But eventually, the first one, the one closest to the house, took a single step forward, its foot landing softly on the grass. And that's when I snapped out of it. I backed away from the window, heart hammering in my chest, and grabbed the phone off the table. I didn't even know who I was going to call. The police? What was I supposed to say? Hey, there's a bunch of things in my yard. They'd think I was crazy. But before I could do anything, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a text or a call. It was a notification from an app I didn't remember downloading. The app had no name, just a black icon. I hesitated for a second before tapping on it, and when it opened, all I saw was a single line of text. Do not go outside. It's not safe. That was it. No sender, no number, just that message, sitting on my screen like a command. I dropped the phone on the couch, my hands shaking. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. How could someone know what was outside? And more importantly, who was sending me these warnings? Then it hit me. The drone. Whoever was controlling it had to be the one watching everything. They had seen me go into the woods, seen me find that bunker, seen that thing at the bottom of the stairs. But now they were watching something else. They were watching them. I looked back out the window, and that's when I saw the drone. It was hovering again, just like before, but this time it wasn't in my backyard. It was above the tree line, its soft hum barely audible. It was watching the things too, monitoring them, keeping them from coming any closer to the house. For a moment, I felt this twisted sense of relief, like the drone was keeping me safe. But then I realized, no, the drone wasn't protecting me. It was just keeping them at bay, like it had control over them, like it owned them. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the drone and the things in the trees, but eventually, one by one, the figures started to retreat. Slowly, they melted back into the woods, their pale bodies disappearing into the shadows. And as they left, the drone quietly drifted away, following them into the night. That's when I understood. The drone wasn't here to monitor me. It was here to control them, to keep them contained, to make sure they didn't get too close. And now, I was involved, whether I liked it or not. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, waiting for the drone to come back, waiting for those things to return. But the woods stayed quiet, for now. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was out there wasn't gone. They were just waiting. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the floor. I must have fallen asleep in the chair by the window, my body aching from the awkward position. For a split second, I convinced myself that everything from the night before had just been a bad dream, that I hadn't seen anything, that those things in the woods weren't real. But then I saw the black icon on my phone screen, still sitting there like a grim reminder. Another message had come through. This one was different from the last, though. It wasn't a warning this time. It was an address. No explanation, no context. Just a set of coordinates, and underneath, a time, 11:30 p.m. I stared at the screen, my heart thudding in my chest. It was like the drone, or whoever was controlling it, was giving me a command, telling me where to go next. And for some reason, I knew this wasn't optional. Ignoring it wasn't going to make this go away. Not after what I'd seen. All day, I kept thinking about those coordinates. I looked them up, just out of curiosity. Turns out the location wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute drive from my house, on the outskirts of town. What made it worse was that I recognized the place. It was an old, run-down warehouse that had been abandoned for years. I'd driven past it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Now, it felt like I was being drawn there, like I didn't have a choice. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, I couldn't sit still. My nerves were shot, and I kept pacing around the house, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Part of me wanted to just pretend I hadn't seen the message, lock all the doors, and wait it out. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do that. I had to know what was going on. I had to figure out what that drone was doing, what those things in the woods were, and why I had been dragged into all of it. So, I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and headed out the door. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. The streets were empty, and the further I got from the town center, the darker it became. No streetlights, no traffic, just the sound of my tires on the road and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The warehouse loomed in the distance, barely visible in the darkness, its broken windows staring at me like empty eyes. I parked a little way down the street and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to talk myself out of this. But then I saw it. The drone, hovering above the warehouse, its faint red light blinking steadily, like it had been waiting for me. I got out of the car and started walking toward the entrance. The front door was hanging off its hinges, the metal rusted and worn. Inside, the place was a wreck. Broken crates, piles of debris, and graffiti covering the walls. But the drone didn't lead me through the main floor. Instead, it drifted down a narrow hallway at the back, where a set of stairs descended into the basement. As I reached the top of the stairs, a cold draft hit me, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. I hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath and heading down. The basement was worse than I expected. Barely any light, just a few old bulbs flickering overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The space was larger than it looked from above, with walls lined with dusty old shelves, filled with strange equipment I couldn't begin to identify. It looked like the remnants of some old experiment, like whoever had been here before had just packed up and left in a hurry. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, there was a large metal door, half hidden by a stack of crates, the kind of door you'd expect to see in a high-security lab or maybe a military base, thick, reinforced, with a series of locks and bolts along the edges. The drone hovered next to it, silently watching me. My mouth was dry as I approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to get out of there. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and grabbed the cold metal handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with concrete walls. The air was even colder down here, and the buzzing of the drone seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. At the end of the corridor, there was another door. This one was smaller, less intimidating, but the hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, barely big enough for a few people to stand in, and in the center of it was something I couldn't comprehend. A large cylindrical tank, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Suspended inside the tank was a figure, just like the one I'd seen in the woods. Pale, long-limbed, its body motionless, except for the occasional twitch of its fingers or the faint ripple of its skin against the glass. This wasn't a creature from the woods. This was made. My stomach churned as I took in the details, the wires and tubes connected to the tank, the strange symbols scrawled on the floor around it, and the faint glow of screens monitoring its every movement. This wasn't just some abandoned warehouse. This was a lab, a secret lab hidden beneath the surface, where things like the one I'd seen were being created, controlled, and experimented on. And then, as if on cue, the drone buzzed past me, hovering over a control panel in the corner of the room. It stopped, almost like it was waiting for me to do something. I stepped toward the panel, my hand shaking. There were buttons, switches, and screens displaying information I couldn't make sense of. But one button stood out. A large, red button, the kind you only ever see in movies. The kind that looks like it controls something dangerous. I stared at it, my mind racing. Why had the drone brought me here? What was I supposed to do? Before I could think it through, there was a noise behind me, a soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The thing in the tank, it was awake. Its head jerked toward me, eyes wide and glossy, its limbs twitching violently against the glass. It pressed its hands against the inside of the tank, its fingers scraping the glass as it struggled to free itself. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I slammed my hand down on the red button. The room filled with a deafening hum as the tank began to drain. The creature thrashed violently, its pale body jerking against the glass. But it was too late. The liquid drained faster, and before long, the creature went limp, slumping against the side of the tank like a discarded rag doll. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the drone buzzed again, louder this time, and drifted back toward the corridor. It didn't have to tell me twice. I bolted out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest, racing up the stairs and out of the warehouse as fast as my legs could carry me. As I reached the car and slammed the door shut, I realized something terrifying. The drone wasn't just monitoring these things. It was giving me orders, and I had no idea why. But one thing was clear. I wasn't done yet. I barely made it home that night, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen. I didn't even remember the drive. 1 minute, I was speeding out of that warehouse parking lot, and the next, I was sitting in my driveway, staring blankly at the dashboard. What the hell had I just done? What was that thing in the tank? And why had I pressed the button? The realization hit me hard. I had killed it. Whatever that creature was, I had been the one to end it, not the drone. Not whoever was behind this. Me. I stumbled into the house, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely get the lock to turn. I dropped onto the couch, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The messages, the drone, the thing in the woods. It all felt like some messed up nightmare I couldn't wake from. That's when my phone buzzed again. Another notification from the black icon. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. My thumb hovered over the screen, and when the message popped up, my stomach dropped. Good work. You've completed the first task. Await further instructions. I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine. First task? What the hell did that mean? Before I could process it, another message came through, this time with a video attachment. My heart raced as I tapped it. The screen went black for a moment, and then the video started. It was grainy, almost like it had been shot with some old security camera, but I could make out the scene, the basement of the warehouse, the tank, the thing I had killed. Except now, there was more. The camera slowly panned to the side, showing rows upon rows of tanks, each one filled with more of those creatures. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some were floating motionless in the liquid, while others twitched and jerked like they were dreaming. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. The camera zoomed in on one of the tanks, focusing on a figure that looked disturbingly familiar. It was taller than the others, its limbs more defined, its skin a sickly gray. It had no eyes, just these deep sunken holes where eyes should have been. And that's when I realized why it looked familiar. It was the same figure I'd seen in the woods that night. The thing that had stood at the edge of my yard. The one that had watched me. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the screen in stunned silence. I felt sick. I had only killed one of them, and there were so many more. What was this? Some kind of twisted experiment? And why was I being dragged into it? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak in the house, every distant sound outside made me jump. I half expected to see the drone hovering outside my window, or worse, one of those things standing in my backyard again, waiting for me to make the next move. But the night passed without incident. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep waiting for this to come to me. I had to take control, figure out what the hell was going on. So, I did something risky. I texted the number, or whatever was behind that black icon. "Who are you?" I typed, my fingers shaking. I didn't expect a response, but within seconds, the screen lit up with a new message. "We are watching. We control." I stared at the words, my pulse racing. We control. Was this some kind of government operation? Some shadowy organization experimenting with things that shouldn't exist? Before I could ask another question, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a link. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on it, and a web page opened. A crude, almost ancient-looking interface with a list of dates and locations. At first, none of it made sense, just random places around the country. But then I saw one of the dates from a few months back, and my blood ran cold. It was the date of a new story I'd heard about. A small town, not too far from here, where several people had gone missing in the woods. Search parties had gone out, but they hadn't found anything. Just reports of strange sightings, bizarre footprints. The case had gone cold, and no one ever found out what happened to those people. But now, it was all starting to connect. The disappearances, the creatures, the drone. This was bigger than I'd realized. These things, whatever they were, had been getting out, and someone was trying to contain them or control them, and somehow I had gotten caught up in it. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my thoughts. Another message. You will be contacted again soon. Stay alert. Do not interfere. That was it. No more information, no more instructions. Just a warning. But I knew one thing for sure. I was in deeper than I ever wanted to be. And now, they knew I was involved. For the next few days, I tried to act like everything was normal. I went to work, came home, watched TV, tried to keep my mind off of what had happened. But every time I stepped outside, I found myself glancing at the tree line, waiting to see one of those things lurking in the shadows, or the drone hovering overhead. And then, last night, something changed. I was sitting in the living room, staring out the window, like I always did, when I noticed it. Movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was one of those creatures again, but as I squinted into the darkness, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, a man wearing a dark suit, standing just inside the tree line. He didn't move, didn't wave. He just stood there, watching my house. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. And then slowly, he raised his hand. He didn't wave though. He pointed at me. The message was clear. I was being watched. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what was happening anymore. Who was this man? What did he want from me? And why was I so important? I don't know where this ends. I don't know if they'll come for me next, or if I'm just another pawn in whatever game they're playing. But one thing's for sure. I've seen too much. The drone hasn't shown up again. Not yet, anyway. But I know it's out there, watching, waiting for the next order. And the worst part? I think I'm starting to understand what's really going on. They aren't just monitoring those creatures. They're preparing for something bigger, something none of us are ready for. And I'm afraid I might be the only one who knows. I uncovered a government conspiracy. Now I'm seeing men in black everywhere. I've never been the type to believe in crazy conspiracy theories. I mean, the whole aliens in Area 51 thing, or the moon landing was faked. That always seemed ridiculous to me. So when I tell you that I stumbled into something I shouldn't have on the dark web, I want you to understand that I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't one of those internet sleuths trying to uncover hidden truths. I just wanted to explore something weird, out of curiosity, and now I think I'm in serious danger. It all started about 2 months ago. I was bored, as usual, and I kept hearing about the dark web from random YouTube videos, Reddit threads, and those urban legends your friends swear are true. You know the type. Don't ever go on the dark web. You'll get hacked. Or, if you buy anything illegal, the FBI will bust down your door. It was honestly tempting me, like a challenge. I thought it would be fun to just take a peek, not to buy anything or look for anything illegal. I just wanted to see what the fuss was about. I've always been decent with computers, so I figured I could handle it. I downloaded Tor, the browser you need to access the dark web, and made sure to use a VPN. I didn't want to take any chances with my IP address or anything. I told myself it was just for fun, just a few hours of poking around, and then I'd go back to my normal YouTube rabbit holes. The first few pages I stumbled on were honestly pretty boring. You hear these horror stories, but mostly it was just poorly designed websites with sketchy links to fake drugs or stolen credit card numbers, a few black market sites, some weird forums, but nothing you couldn't imagine existing on the regular internet, just more hidden. After an hour or so of clicking around, I was about to call it a night, but then I found this link buried on some random forum post. It wasn't flashy, just a simple sentence that said, "The truth lies here," with a URL next to it. I know. It sounds like something out of a bad movie, right? But I was intrigued. I figured it was just another dumb conspiracy site, and part of me wanted to laugh. So, like an idiot, I clicked it. The page loaded slower than anything I've ever seen. It was like my computer was straining under the weight of it. When it finally came up, it was this basic, almost retro-looking webpage. Black background, white text, no graphics, no ads, just a single paragraph at the top that said, "This information is not for the public. If you're here, you're already in too deep." Okay, so now I'm thinking, cool, some guy's creepy little project, whatever. But what came next was different. There were a bunch of clickable links below that initial warning. Some had weird titles like The Mind Control Project, Human Experimentation, and one that just said, "They're watching you." It felt cheesy, like some kind of ARG, alternate reality game, or something. But I clicked on the first link, The Mind Control Project, because I figured if this was fake, it would at least be entertaining. The link opened up a new page, and that's when things started getting strange. It wasn't a wall of text like I expected. Instead, it was a bunch of old scanned documents. You know the type, like photocopies of government papers with the blacked out redactions. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. It seemed random, dates, locations, numbers, but the more I scrolled, the more I realized they weren't random at all. They were logs of experiments. I'm not talking about like harmless psychology experiments or surveys. These were dark, the kind of stuff that makes your skin crawl. From what I could gather, it looked like these experiments had been going on for decades, brainwashing, manipulating memories, inducing fear responses. One paper mentioned something called MK Ultra, which I'd heard of before in conspiracy circles, but this went way beyond that. There were details about subjects being taken from hospitals, their families being told they had died unexpectedly. In reality, they were shipped off to remote facilities, drugged, tortured, and reprogrammed? That's the word they used. Reprogrammed, like they were robots or something. I started feeling sick to my stomach. This was some heavy stuff, but I couldn't stop scrolling. I was deep into this folder of documents, just mindlessly clicking through, when I heard this faint sound. At first, I thought it was just background noise from the house, maybe my radiator or something. But no, it wasn't coming from my apartment. It was coming from my headphones. It was static, like old TV static, low and crackling, but with an underlying hum. I can't really explain it, but it freaked me out. I quickly closed the tab and yanked off my headphones, breathing heavily. My heart was racing. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be there, watching me. But of course, I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. I figured maybe I'd accidentally opened a video or something that caused the noise, but I didn't have any other tabs open, just the dark web page. And here's where it gets even weirder. When I tried to reload the page, it was gone. Like, poof, just disappeared. All I got was a 404 error, page not found. I'm not one to scare easily, but this shook me. I mean, I knew the dark web could be unstable, but I'd never had a page just vanish like that, especially one that felt significant. My rational mind kept telling me it was just some weird internet glitch, but part of me, the part that was still freaked out, wondered if maybe I wasn't supposed to see what I saw. I closed everything down, cleared my browser, even deleted Tor from my laptop. It felt extreme, but I was spooked. I went to bed that night telling myself it was just a stupid website, probably some hoax, nothing to worry about. But then, the next morning, I saw them, the men in black. They were standing across the street from my apartment, just watching. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Two guys in black suits, maybe waiting for a ride or something, but they weren't talking to each other. They weren't on their phones. They were just standing there, facing my building, completely still. I tried to shake off the paranoia. This isn't happening, I told myself. It's just a coincidence. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became. They were watching me. The first time I saw them, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. You know how sometimes you see a couple of people standing outside, and you start thinking they're there for you. It's usually nothing. But these two, I don't know. Something about them didn't sit right. They were both tall, wearing black suits, black ties, and black hats. No sunglasses though. That's what threw me off. I always imagined the whole men in black thing as guys in shades with no emotion, like in the movies. But these two were different. They just stood there with their hands in their pockets, staring up at my window. It was early, like 7 a.m., and there wasn't any reason for anyone to be hanging around the street in front of my building. I live in a quiet neighborhood, nothing too exciting. But these guys, they stuck out, and it felt like they were meant to stick out. I watched them for a few minutes, thinking maybe they'd move on, but they didn't. Just stood there, motionless, staring up at me, or at least in my direction. The more I stared back, the more convinced I was that they were here because of what I found last night. At that point, I didn't want to believe it. I mean, it was a weird coincidence. Sure, but no way was it connected to some dumb website on the dark web, right? But the longer I thought about it, the harder it was to shake the feeling that maybe I'd stumbled onto something real, something I wasn't supposed to see. I grabbed my phone and took a picture of them. I figured if I was losing it, at least I'd have proof to remind myself that this actually happened. But when I looked at the screen, the picture didn't look right. I don't know how to explain it, but the image was distorted. Not blurry, but like warped. The two guys in the photo looked like they were smudged, almost pixelated, like my phone couldn't properly capture them. The street and background were crystal clear, but the men, they looked wrong. I tried again, and the same thing happened. That was when I started freaking out. I ducked down below my window, heart racing, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. Call the cops. What was I going to tell them? Yeah, two creepy guys in suits are staring at my apartment. They'd laugh me off, or worse, tell me to stop watching YouTube conspiracy videos. I waited for about 10 minutes, peeking out every now and then, hoping they'd just disappear. finally, when I dared to look again, they were gone. No sign of them anywhere. I can't even explain the wave of relief that washed over me. Maybe I was imagining the whole thing, letting my brain spin out of control. I tried to convince myself of that. Maybe they were just two guys waiting for a ride, and I was making it into something it wasn't. But that sense of relief didn't last long. Later that day, I went out to run some errands. I thought a bit of fresh air would help me clear my head, maybe convince me I'd been overreacting. But as I walked to the corner store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced behind me, there was no one there, just the regular stream of people going about their day. But that feeling wouldn't leave. It wasn't until I got to the store that I saw them again. I was grabbing some snacks, trying to calm down, and when I walked up to the counter, there they were, standing just outside the glass window. Same black suits, same blank expressions, only now they were closer, much closer. They were standing right outside the entrance to the store, staring in at me like they were waiting for me to come out. I froze. I couldn't move. My hands started shaking so bad, I nearly dropped the bag of chips I was holding. The guy behind the counter must have noticed because he gave me this weird look, like I was on something. But what was I supposed to say? Hey, you see those creepy guys out there staring at me? Instead, I just nodded, paid for my stuff, and backed away from the window. I took the long way out, sneaking around the side entrance just to avoid passing them. Once I was outside, I did what any normal person would do. I ran, like full-on sprinted back to my apartment, hoping that if I put enough distance between us, they'd lose interest. But when I turned the corner toward my building, I spotted them again. They weren't running after me, but somehow they were already ahead of me, standing near the alley next to my building, their faces turned toward me as if they'd known where I'd be. That's when I stopped caring if I looked like a lunatic. I bolted into my building, slammed the door behind me, and ran up the stairs to my apartment. I didn't look out the window for the rest of the night. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what I might see. For the next few days, I stayed in. I barely went out, only to grab the bare necessities, and every time I did, I felt eyes on me. Even when I couldn't see them, I knew they were there, somewhere, waiting, watching. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to believe that these men in black were real. But every time I stepped out of my apartment, there was something off. People I'd never noticed before suddenly felt wrong, like they didn't belong. Blank expressions, unblinking eyes, just standing around on street corners or sitting in parked cars for hours. I couldn't tell if they were the same guys in different clothes or if there were more of them. One morning, I was making coffee, trying to convince myself to get back to normal when there was a knock on my door. It was weird, because no one ever knocks. My friends always text me before they show up, and the mailman never comes that early. I peeked through the peephole, and there they were, two men in black suits. No hats this time, no expression, just standing there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for me to answer. I didn't. I couldn't. I just stood there, my breath caught in my throat, heart pounding. They knocked again, slowly, deliberately, not loud, just steady, like they knew I was there. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling. They knocked a third time, then finally, silence. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole again. They were gone, but taped to my door was a small envelope, plain and white, with no writing on it. I hesitated before grabbing it, half expecting it to explode or something ridiculous. But nothing happened. It was just an envelope. I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten, with just one line. Stop looking. That's when I knew for sure, whatever I had found that night, Whatever I'd seen on that dark web page, it was real. And now, they were making sure I didn't dig any deeper. But I wasn't going to stop, even though I knew I should. After the envelope incident, I knew I should have stopped. Any sane person would have stopped. I wasn't a detective, a hacker, or some underground journalist. I was just some guy who got in over his head, and now I had proof that whoever was watching me wasn't playing around. The logical thing to do would have been to erase everything, move, change my identity, whatever it took to disappear. But something inside me couldn't let it go. It wasn't just curiosity. It was like a switch had been flipped in my brain, and now I needed to know what the hell was going on. It wasn't just about me anymore. The documents I saw, those experiments, the mind control projects, they felt too real, too detailed. If even a fraction of it was true, it meant there were people out there who were victims, whose entire lives had been erased. And if they were doing this to people, what else could they be hiding? For the next few days, I laid low. I didn't leave my apartment. I barely slept. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I expected them to come back. Those men in black. I kept the envelope on my kitchen counter, unopened since that first day, as a constant reminder that I was in danger. One night, I decided to go back online. Not on the dark web, I wasn't that stupid, but just to do some research. I wanted to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. I searched Reddit, conspiracy forums, anything that could connect the dots. Surprisingly, there were quite a few stories like mine. People who claimed they'd seen men in black after digging into classified or government files. Most of the stories ended the same way. Either the person disappeared, or they stopped talking about it completely. One post even had a photo of the men. Blurry, of course, like my own picture. But still, there was something eerily similar about them. Same suits, same blank expressions. I started piecing together bits of information, learning about past government experiments like MK Ultra and this other project called Stargate. Apparently, these were real, documented programs where the government tested mind control, psychic abilities, remote viewing, you name it. Most of these projects were officially shut down, but according to what I found, some believed they never really ended. They just went deeper underground, and I think that's what I had stumbled onto. Something way bigger than I'd ever imagined. At around 2 a.m., when I was deep into one of these forums, my screen glitched out. The browser froze for a second, and I thought my laptop was about to crash, but then my screen went completely black. I figured maybe it was just overheating or something, but before I could restart it, something appeared. It wasn't a typical error screen or blue screen of death. It was a single message in white text against the black background, like someone had hijacked my computer. The message said, "You were warned. This is your final chance." My stomach dropped. I'd been careful. I wasn't even on the dark web, and I was using a VPN. So how the hell did they find me again? My hands were shaking so bad, I nearly knocked over the coffee cup next to my laptop. I scrambled to pull the plug from my router, but it didn't matter. The message was still there, as if it was burned into my screen. Then, without warning, my webcam light blinked on. I hadn't used my webcam in months. I kept it taped over just in case. I'd heard enough stories about hackers using webcams to spy on people, but seeing that tiny green light flicker on sent my mind into overdrive. Whoever they were watching me. Right now. I slammed the laptop shut, yanked the power cord out, and threw the whole thing onto the floor like it was toxic. My heart was pounding so loud, I could hear it in my ears. I paced around my apartment, trying to figure out what to do next. Calling the police wasn't an option. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they were in on it. You hear about government connections in law enforcement all the time. If these men in black were really part of some shadowy operation, how far did their reach go? For a moment, I considered grabbing my stuff and leaving town. But where would I even go? If they could find me online, they could probably track me anywhere. I wasn't safe. That's when I noticed the blinking light on my phone. I picked it up, half expecting another creepy message, but instead, I had a voicemail. No missed call, just the voicemail icon. I hesitated, but eventually hit play. At first, it was nothing but static. Low, faint, just like the sound I'd heard through my headphones that night on the dark web. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't just static. There was something behind it. A voice, whispering, distorted, but definitely human. Stop. Looking. Then the line went dead. I dropped the phone, like it was burning my hand. It felt like my entire apartment was closing in on me. The walls, the windows, even the furniture, it all felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be here, like I was invading my own space. My mind kept racing back to the experiments I'd read about. Brainwashing, psychological control. Was this what it felt like to lose control of your own thoughts? Was I being manipulated? I sat on the floor for hours, trying to piece together what was happening to me. The men in black weren't just watching. They were inside my head now, planting fear, pushing me closer to the edge. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this was exactly what those documents had described. These weren't just threats, they were tests, experiments, and I was the subject. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every shift in the shadows felt like someone was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. If they wanted me to stop digging, I had to find out why. I couldn't just sit around waiting for them to come knocking again. I went back online, this time on my phone, using the public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop a few blocks from my place. I didn't trust my home internet anymore. I went straight to the forums, posting about everything that had happened since I'd clicked that link. I was vague, trying not to give away too much, but I was desperate for answers. I needed to know if anyone else had been through what I was going through. It didn't take long for replies to start flooding in. Most people were skeptical, of course. They thought I was making it all up for attention, or that I was just another conspiracy nut. But there were a few, just a few, who knew exactly what I was talking about. They shared similar experiences, the same men in black suits, the same warnings, the same feeling of being constantly watched. One guy even said he'd gotten the same voicemail, word for word. But it was the last comment that really got to me. It wasn't from an account I recognized. In fact, it had been created just minutes before posting. No avatar, no post history, nothing. The comment simply read, "They already know where you are. You can't hide." And then, before I could even respond, the account was deleted. At that moment, I felt it again. That pressure in the air, that overwhelming sensation of being watched. I glanced up from my phone, and there they were, the men in black. They were standing outside the coffee shop, not moving, just watching me, through the glass, like they knew exactly what I'd been doing, like they'd been waiting for me to slip up again. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. For a second, I thought about running, but deep down, I knew there was nowhere left to run. There was nowhere left to run. That was the first thing that really sunk in as I sat there, staring out the window at the men in black. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even flinch when a car honked as it passed by. They were like statues, placed there for one purpose, to let me know that I was caught. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my chest felt tight, like a vice was slowly squeezing the air out of me. I didn't dare move, didn't even dare look at my phone again. It was like every part of me was screaming to stay still, to do nothing that might provoke them. But I knew I couldn't stay there forever. They were waiting for me to crack. Minutes ticked by, though it felt like hours. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. Every time someone walked past the window, I hoped they'd stop, maybe confront these guys, but no one did. It was like they were invisible to everyone but me. Or maybe everyone else was too scared to notice. That's what terrified me the most, that people could see something so blatantly wrong and just ignore it. Maybe they knew better than I did. Finally, I decided to make a move. It was like this primal instinct kicked in, telling me I had to do something, anything, to get out of this situation. So I got up, as casually as I could, grabbed my phone, and headed towards the back of the coffee shop. There was a side exit there, one that led into a narrow alley. I figured if I could slip out quietly, I might be able to lose them in the maze of side streets and alleys that crisscrossed the neighborhood. I pushed open the door slowly, wincing as it creaked on its hinges. The alley was empty, just a narrow strip of concrete between two brick buildings. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. For a moment, I felt a small wave of relief. No sign of them. Maybe, just maybe, I had a chance. I started walking, trying to keep my pace steady, my footsteps light. I kept my eyes on the ground, avoiding looking at any windows or doorways, as if not seeing them would make them disappear. I turned the first corner I came to, then another, winding through the back streets, trying to put as much distance between me and the coffee shop as possible. But then, as I turned one last corner, I froze. They were there, standing at the end of the alley, blocking the only exit. The same two men, same black suits, same cold, expressionless faces. It was like they had just materialized out of nowhere. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. How had they gotten there so fast? I'd been so careful, so quiet. I backed up slowly, my mind racing. There was nowhere to go. The alley was a dead end, the walls too high to climb. Panic started to take over. They started walking toward me, their footsteps echoing ominously in the narrow space. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They knew I was trapped. That's when I noticed the door. Halfway down the alley on my left, there was a metal door, slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to close it properly. I didn't have time to think. I bolted for it, shoving it open and slipping inside, just as the men reached the spot where I'd been standing. The door led into an old, abandoned building, some kind of storage facility, judging by the rows of dusty shelves and broken crates scattered around. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but I didn't care. I was just grateful for a place to hide. I crouched behind one of the shelves, trying to quiet my breathing, listening for any sign that they'd followed me inside. The minutes dragged on, and I heard nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the distant sounds of the city outside. I started to think that maybe I'd lost them. Maybe they hadn't seen me slip through the door. I allowed myself a moment of hope, just a flicker, that I'd managed to outsmart them, Then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like the hinges of an old door being slowly pushed open. My blood ran cold. They were inside. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear their movements. The building was large, filled with rows of shelves and narrow passageways. I could hide here for a while, but sooner or later, they would find me. They had to know that. And yet, they weren't rushing. I could hear their slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the building, getting closer. I glanced around, trying to find another way out. There had to be an exit somewhere, but the place was like a maze, and I was running out of time. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I could almost feel them, like the pressure in the air was thickening with every step they took. That's when I saw it, a small window near the ceiling, high up on the wall behind me. It was dirty and cracked, but it was my only chance. If I could reach it, I might be able to climb out and escape before they found me. But I had to be quick. I started moving, staying low, weaving between the shelves, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps were so close now, echoing off the concrete floor. I reached the wall and looked up at the window. It was higher than I'd thought, too high to reach without something to stand on. Frantically, I scanned the room, my eyes landing on an old wooden crate. It was battered and worn, but it looked sturdy enough. I dragged it over to the wall as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I climbed up, wobbling slightly, as the crate shifted under my weight, and pushed the window open. The cool night air hit my face, a rush of fresh air that almost made me dizzy with relief. But then, just as I was about to pull myself through, the crate gave way. I fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The sound of the crate breaking echoed through the building, loud and unmistakable. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, glancing toward the direction of the footsteps. They were there, standing at the end of the aisle, just watching me. I was out of time. I turned back to the window, desperate, and leapt up, grabbing onto the ledge. My fingers scraped against the rough concrete, but I managed to pull myself up, kicking against the wall for leverage. I could hear them moving closer, their footsteps no longer slow and deliberate, but quick, purposeful. They were coming for me. With one last effort, I hoisted myself through the window, landing hard on the pavement outside. I didn't stop to look back. I ran, sprinting down the alley, around the corner, and into the street. I didn't care where I was going, just that I had to get as far away from that building, from those men, as possible. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead, but I kept running. I couldn't stop, couldn't let them catch me. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car passing by, but I didn't see anyone. I was alone, completely alone, with no idea where I was going. I must have run for blocks before I finally slowed down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ducked into another alley, collapsing against the wall, my entire body trembling. I listened, straining to hear if they had followed me, but all I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears. For the moment, it seemed like I had lost them, but I knew better than to think I was safe. The men in black were relentless, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, or where I could even go from here. I was in way over my head, deeper than I ever could have imagined, and now I was truly alone. I don't know how long I sat in that alley, trying to catch my breath, listening to my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. The world around me seemed to close in, The sounds of the city distant, muffled, like I was underwater. I couldn't hear them anymore, the men in black, but I knew they weren't far. They never were. I had to move, had to keep going. If I stayed in one place too long, they'd find me. They always found me. My mind raced, trying to figure out where to go. My apartment wasn't safe. Public places weren't safe. Even online, they were waiting. I had no idea how they tracked me, but they always seemed one step ahead. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I stopped running. I know how that sounds. Stupid, right? But something in me snapped at that moment. I couldn't keep playing their game, couldn't keep running from shadows that seemed to multiply every time I turned around. I was going to face them. I didn't know how or what I'd do, but I couldn't keep living like this. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went back to where it all started. I waited until dawn, hiding in the shadows, my mind on autopilot, running purely on adrenaline and instinct. When the sun finally started to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of gray and orange, I headed out. I didn't see anyone on the streets, no men in black, no suspicious figures lurking in the corners. It was almost as if they disappeared, but I knew better. I made my way across town, back to my apartment, and grabbed the one thing I hadn't dared to touch since that first night, my old laptop. The one I'd shut off and thrown on the floor after that message appeared. It was still there, lying on the floor next to my bed, the screen blank and lifeless. For a moment, I hesitated. Turning it on felt like opening a door I couldn't close again. But I had no choice. I needed answers. I powered it on, half expecting the same black screen, the same ominous message. But nothing happened. It booted up like normal, the desktop flickering to life. I quickly connected to the internet, not through my home network, but through a burner phone hotspot I'd set up for emergencies. I wasn't going to make it easy for them this time. I started digging. I went back to the forums, back to the threads where people had talked about the men in black, the government conspiracies, the hidden projects. I found the same users who had given vague hints before, and this time I messaged them directly. I didn't care if they thought I was paranoid. I needed to know what I was up against. One by one, I got responses. Most were short, cryptic, as if the people on the other end were scared to say too much. But there was one user, someone who went by the name Watcher118, who gave me more than I expected. He told me the men in black weren't just government agents. They were something else, something inhuman. He didn't know exactly what they were, but he claimed they weren't working for the government. The government was working for them. I read his messages over and over, trying to make sense of it all. It sounded insane, but after everything I'd seen, everything that had happened, I couldn't dismiss it. He said that once you catch their attention, once you see behind the curtain, they don't stop until they've erased you. Not physically. No, they don't need to kill you. They just erase you from existence. They mess with your mind, your memories, until you don't even know who you are anymore, until no one remembers you. I asked him how he knew all of this. He didn't respond for a long time. I thought maybe he'd disappeared like the others, but then a message finally popped up. Because they're coming for me too. That was the last thing he ever sent me. His account was deleted minutes later. My hands were shaking as I closed the laptop, my head spinning with everything I'd just read. Was that their plan for me? To erase me, to make me forget who I was, until I didn't exist anymore. The thought of it made my stomach churn. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. But I was tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to show up. I had to confront them. I had to end this. I grabbed a backpack, threw in some essentials, and walked out of my apartment for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't bother locking the door behind me. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. I made my way to the one place I'd been avoiding, the building where it all started, the alley, the storage facility, that window I'd climbed out of during my desperate escape. If I was going to find answers, if I was going to stop them, I had to go back to where they'd first shown themselves. It felt right, in a twisted way, like I was completing a circle. When I got there, the building looked different. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if something had actually changed, but it felt wrong, more wrong than before. The door I'd used was still slightly ajar, just like I remembered. I hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. Inside, everything was the same, the rows of dusty shelves, the scattered crates. It was eerily silent, like the air was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. That's when I saw them, standing at the far end of the room, in the same spot where I'd first seen them. The men in black. They were waiting for me. This time, I didn't run. I walked straight toward them, my heart pounding in my chest, but my mind strangely calm. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. Angry that they had taken over my life, turned it into a nightmare, made me question my own sanity. They didn't move. They just stood there, their blank faces staring, unblinking as I approached. When I was only a few feet away, I stopped. For a long moment, none of us said anything. Then one of them, the one on the left, spoke. "It's over. You've seen too much." His voice was cold, emotionless, like it was being generated by a machine. There was something unnatural about it, like it wasn't even coming from him. I took a deep breath, my fists clenched. "What are you?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this?" They didn't answer. Instead, they stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. I backed up, my pulse racing again, but I refused to run. I wasn't going to be their experiment, their victim. But then something strange happened. The air around them started to shift, like a ripple in reality. Their forms flickered, distorted, like static on an old television. For a split second, I saw something else beneath their human facades, something dark, twisted, and not of this world. My mind couldn't process it, couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. Then, just as quickly, they snapped back to their original form. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever they weren't human. And now I understood. They weren't erasing people. They were consuming them, feeding off the fear, the paranoia, twisting their minds until there was nothing left. I didn't wait for them to speak again. I turned and ran faster than I ever had before, out of the building, out of the alley, into the streets. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, until the city lights had faded into the distance. I never went back. But they still find me, in the corners of my vision, in the silence between breaths. They're still out there, waiting for me to slip up again, to look too closely, to ask the wrong question. And I know that one day they'll come for me.